everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Future Tech Podcast. It's me, Charlie Sell, the board director of Major Group, where I get a chance to speak to thought leaders, people passionate about STEM, technology, and people who've got just wonderful, different variety of life stories. This is all aimed at STEM young people looking to try and get into careers. It's sponsored by the STEM Ambassador Association. And today I'm really, really pleased to have Dave Wascha with me. Now, I actually first met Dave at Seacon conference recently. He's a well-renowned speaker and massive, massive thought leader into technology and product. And is now a founder of an advisory firm called Elegant Rampage, which I just said to him, I love that name, where he advises everyone from startups to scale-ups, just passionate about technology and helping companies succeed. So there's going to be some really interesting stories there. And also, I think we're going to be quite open about some of David's life stories with his family and challenges and opportunities. So let's jump straight in. And David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
It's, as I said, it's so good to have people like yourself on the podcast that's got such a variety of experience. And so let's jump straight in and tell us a bit about your story. How did you get into technology and a bit about your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a fairly typical path at this point. I was very fortunate when I was growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, that I had a father who was a bit of an early adopter of tech and had the means to purchase an Apple IIe. So very. I always forget what the equivalent is over here. The common first computer in the UK. I grew up in America, in the States, but this was one of the first kind of home computers that you could purchase. And so I'm not sure how much my father got out of it. I certainly became obsessed with it and trying to do anything and everything I could with it. I taught myself about relational databases. I taught myself, Turbo Pascal, which for anyone listening to this is probably too young to recognize that it's the name of a programming language, which is very, very old, but it's the first one I encountered. I had such a excitement and obsession, really. I would do it till the wee hours of the morning, and ended up trying to write applications for anything that I could. I wrote an application to run charity auctions. I wrote an application before most, contact managers to keep track of as a teenager, all of my vast number of contacts was probably like 8 people. But I just wanted to write the app. So I was, anyways, very fortunate to have grown up in a time when you could purchase a computer for a reasonable amount of money, and coming from a family that had the means to purchase it. So I recognized that not very, a lot of people don't have that opportunity. And that really led to, a real fascination with technology. I did a lot of volunteering with different charities in terms of helping them program different applications. Ultimately went to university to study computer science. I got 2 degrees, one in philosophy and one in computer science, but I loved computer science. And then I got invited to go out and interview for a job at a company out in the Pacific Northwest called Microsoft. And I went out there saying there's no way that I'm going to actually take this job, but they invited me and they offered to fly my girlfriend at the time out and put us up in a very swanky hotel. So I couldn't turn that offer down. And I fell in love with it so much. It was just like an absolute playground that I flew back to where I went to university, packed up my car and my dog, and drove back across the country and started probably 4 or 5 days later at Microsoft. And that was my first role, and it was amazing. It was an amazing place to work. I feel so fortunate to have worked there. Microsoft's had various reputations in its history, not the least of which was being sued by the federal government in the United States for antitrust. But an amazing first job. And it was my first job for 14 years. My second job ever was when I moved to the UK in 2010. And that was the second job interview I'd ever had since university. And then I've lived in the UK. I moved here because my wife is English, and we moved for personal reasons. Um, and I've had, again, the great fortune to have worked with some brilliant companies and brilliant founders. I've worked with Moo.com. I've worked at TravelX, kind of trying to reinvent what was a 45-year-old business at the time. Photobox and Moonpig, which are brilliant companies that most people in the UK are familiar with. And then most recently, I worked at a property real estate marketplace called Zoopla. And then decided to go at my own earlier this year um, for a couple reasons that we might get into a little bit later when we talk about some of the things going on in the family. Yeah, I've been doing that since then. It's been great.
Yeah, wow. And it's so nice to hear when people have got that blend of both working for like you say, big tech businesses like Microsoft, and then also getting that insight into the startup and scale up worlds. And I'm sure, and again, we'll probably cover it a bit in the sort of career advice section where you can get pros and cons, you can opportunities and disadvantages of both
Yeah.
types of businesses, and being open minded. So
Well, just when I left Microsoft, there were 150,000 people, and the next role, which is at Moo, there were 90 people in the company.
yeah, two
Yeah.
huge extremes, and I'm sure there would be some lessons there on how you had to adapt. And so focusing then on career advice, which we were both discussing previously, but prior to this is something you're really passionate. We didn't want this to become a secondary thought to a lot of our listeners. And so, talk to me a bit about the advice you would give young people, and looking to get into tech. What would advice would you give?
Yeah, I mean, I spend quite a bit of time working with people early in their careers. Not necessarily as early along as a lot of the audience for the podcast here, but I think it's equally applicable. Um, I think in an ironic and maybe unfortunate way, I don't think most people don't tend to put that much thought into their careers, and they define progression in their career or advancement in the advancement of their take home pay and in the advancement of the titles of the roles that they get. And, having made that mistake myself and having observed many people make that mistake, and, I've interviewed, at this point, in terms of trying to recruit and hire in businesses, I stopped counting at about 5,000 people. And I've hired and managed hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Um, and I think certainly earlier on, people mistake kind of the definition of progress for making more money and having bigger titles. And when they go looking for a role, that's what they go looking for. And I don't think that leads to satisfaction, and I don't think it leads to ultimately the level of success that you could have if you took a different approach. And so when I work with people, when I do some career coaching and career counseling, um, I talk about the concept of career capital. And career capital is very simply the experiences, the knowledge, and the skills that you need to acquire in order to be progressively more successful in the roles that you find fulfilling. And it's not a concept that I came up with. It's the author named Cal Newport wrote a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. It's a great book, very accessible. It's a quick read. I recommend it to anybody. I've recommended it hundreds of times. But he introduces that concept of career capital. And the lens that I encourage people to view their career advancement through is not the acquisition of more money, but the acquisition of more career capital. So being very clear on, if you want to go into tech, what are the experiences, the skills, and the knowledge that you need to acquire in order to do that? You need computer literacy. You may want to take um, computer science, GCSE. Some of this is very obvious, but it's just an example of, like, if you think about the experience, the skills, and knowledge that you need to acquire in order to be successful in your roles. And I encourage people to choose jobs based on the opportunity to acquire that capital, even if it feels like it's a move that's sideways, or even if it's a move where people feel like they're taking a cut in their take home pay, or it's a company that isn't necessarily kind of fulfilling on all the aspects. I think that they might not find it to be the most exciting place to work. But if you can work someplace for 1 or 2 years and really focus on acquiring a skill that that job affords you, I think you'll be much better off in the long run when you view your career that way. Um, and if you do view your career that way, you won't have to worry about make the money and the titles and things like that, because you will be really well prepared and really well set up to be an amazing candidate, an amazing employee. And so, while it's often counterintuitive to people, I try to help people be far more intentional in how they look for a role, the kinds, their criteria for a new job, etc. Um, and then I suppose perhaps for this audience, which is a little bit younger, I tend to talk with people that are in the workplace, in their 20s and 30s. Um, I think the most important things, again, fundamentally, certainly in your younger years, are to have a growth mindset. Um, and again, I'm a big fan of, and that concept didn't exist when I was growing up. I really wish it did. But a growth mindset, for those who aren't familiar with it, is essentially a mindset that says if you put time and effort into something, you can improve your ability to do it. And the opposite of that, for illustrative purposes, is something called a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset is what I had when I was growing up, which is if you're not immediately good at something, then you won't ever be good at it. So you shouldn't bother even trying. And I just have a lot of, a sense of almost loss and remorse for all the years of my childhood that I spent not doing things or not trying new things because I wasn't immediately good at them. And so, I really encourage people to. There's a great book. It's called Mindset. It's by a woman named Carol Dweck. It's very short. And it effectively kind of illustrates some research. She's a psychologist. Some research she did on the kind of happiness and success of people that adopt this growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. So, I would say certainly those who have a growth mindset, and it's not just something you switch on. You have to put effort into it. If you're not naturally a growth mindset like I was, are just shown time and time again to be more happy and more successful in the long run than people with a fixed mindset. And so my wife and I have both really tried to raise our kids with a growth mindset. When I talk about careers, those are the two things that I tend to focus on. And if you have a growth mindset, and if you take a career capital view of choosing your roles, I'm highly confident that the outcome will be you'll be a much more fulfilled, much happier, and much more successful person than alternatives.
Yeah. And I love that. I love how you've been able to summarize that into two really clear and succinct areas. And I couldn't agree with you more, especially around career capital. It's not about career titles and salary. And for a lot of the young people listening, what's nice is the world has changed now that a lot of people look for many more things from a business, from a job, from a career. And for a lot of young people, the career capital can also be about the values of the business and the values of what you want to value yourself, isn't it? It's not just about the learning; it's also about being happy or respecting the place you work, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I would say we could spend a lot of time on this. I don't think that people should look for their job or their employment to be everything for them in terms of like completely aligned with their values and their personal mission, and they may want it to be a family and things like that. I think a lot of companies tried to fumble their way through that during the pandemic when everyone was trying to support everybody. But I think people who are able not to try and put all of those hopes and all of those into their job, I think will probably be happier in the long run as well.
Yeah, really interesting point. And I guess it leads us nicely then to think about, because you've experienced both sides of this, and we touched on it earlier about the reason you started your own advisory firm, and there's family reasons for it, and what's been nice around the world today is there's people are starting to wake up and realize that many people are different, and there's not just gender diversity, but social, economic, and neurodiversity. And you're experiencing it yourself on how to raise a child into that. Do you want to just tell us a bit more about your learnings and a bit about the family situation?
Yeah. So I left my role. I mean, it was a natural point to leave my last role. I'd been there for nearly 4 years at Zoopla. But equally, we had been having quite a difficult time with our daughter. At the time, my 8-year-old daughter. She's now 9, um, and it gotten to a point where she wasn't able to go to school. On many days, she wasn't able to leave her room, um, and we were obviously very concerned for her. And we were really left in a strange situation where we couldn't understand what was going on. We couldn't find anyone to help us understand what was going on. We were scouring the web and everything else, um, reading lots of books. I have a whole shelf of books on the topic of neurodiversity behind me, um, and but it turns out, after a lot of trial and error and a lot of trying to understand the system so that we could work the system, that my daughter was diagnosed with autism, and so one of the reasons that I left my role at Zoopla is because she wasn't leaving the house, and my wife is a veterinarian, and she can't do her job over Zoom. Maybe not, maybe sometime in the future, but not today. And so I opted to stay home and try and support my daughter in trying to figure out, how we could better support her and try to get her, into a better place and back into school. And we're very fortunate. Again, we've got the means to try and support our daughter, and we've got a good support network of friends and family, and um, but we're my wife and I are, together. We've since met many single parents who are trying to raise children with autism, and the most amazing the most amazing woman that I met. We were in a parenting. My wife and I were taking a parenting course for parents of children with autism. It's called Signet, and I highly recommend it. Um, and we met a woman who is a single mother who has 2 children with autism, and their diagnoses are different. So they don't even have, this. I think most people, hopefully at this point, are aware that, we say that autism is a spectrum. And it really is, because it's a very blanket term. It's actually a really unhelpful term to encapsulate dozens or even hundreds of different kinds of characteristics of neurodiversity. But the profiles of each of her 2 children were very different, and they were also, I think, 4 years apart. So I mean, there were very different life stages as well. And so we got to hear all these stories about parents struggling with what we were struggling with, and we were coming from a position of amazing, good fortune and everything else. And so it's just amazing to see. But the thing that really became clear to me was like how much in the dark ages that we are as a society about our ability to recognize these things as something other than just children being naughty. It really just a lot of it really looks like children being naughty, and it's not. The children are miserable and unhappy, and they're panicking, and they're filled with anxiety, and it manifests as what might look like children misbehaving. But it's it's reasonably, as these kinds of things go, it's reasonably prevalent, right? It's something that impacts kind of 5-ish% of the population, like I think so severely, and in some cases, not only are these children kind of not able to cope themselves, but they're also kind of taking down entire classrooms with them as well. It's not just impacting them, but it's impacting their family and their classroom and their teacher and everything else. And it just became really frustratingly obvious how little people are trained to recognize these things. The support and the resources are not easy to find. You have to get a PhD in navigating the system, understanding the system. All the different boroughs use different languages, and they have different systems, and they have different things that they can help with. And a lot of the different boroughs don't only recognize certain characteristics, and others, they don't recognize at all. And so it's just something um, that I've become really passionate about trying to help. I mean, there's some people in the tech community. There's a guy named Rob Haynes, who's the founder of Founders Intelligence, who actually you should have on the podcast. He's a fascinating guy and absolutely brilliant. He and I spent some time together. His son has autism as well, and he's written about it online. And he's incredibly passionate about using technology to help diagnose and support not only the individuals that are neurodiverse, but also their schools and their families and everything else. And so, he and I are going to be spending some time doing that. But, of all the things out there, medical, psychological, that are recognized, understood and supported, we're really nowhere when it comes to some of these neurodiverse types of things, like the people on the spectrum.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and that's a real eye opener, and thank you for sharing. And I guess trying to bringing it to knowing that there will be listeners who who have autism. As you said, it's a spectrum, and so there'll be some hidden characteristics to it as well as some very obvious ones. But if people are aware of their own stage, what's your views on what can companies do, what can society do to actually help give an equal opportunity? Because in my experience, some of the most intelligent, capable engineers I've ever worked with are openly neurodiverse.
That's right.
And so have you got any thoughts on what society or companies or what people can do to actually acknowledge and help people with neurodiversity have an
I
equal
I
footing?
think it may sound overly simple, but I think just acknowledge, openly acknowledging, and seeking out people with neurodiverse profiles. I think in most places there's still a lot of stigma attached with people with different neurodiverse, and because it is. And I hate to say the word disability, but that tends to be the common word. But because it's a disability that you can't see, um, I think people still carry around a lot of shame. They don't want it. They think that it will limit their ability to progress or to be successful, or they might be reluctant to ask for the types of accommodations that they might need um, in order to do their best work. And so, I think just as a company, acknowledging um, that you're open to kind of when you talk about building a diverse workforce, that you include neurodiversity in that. Have policies in place that will allow accommodations, right? Different work hours, or a lot of people with sensory issues like find it very difficult and sometimes impossible to work in an open plan environment. They'd much rather be in a quiet room um, or working from home. I think I had a chance to tour the headquarters of Kickstarter in New Jersey a couple of years ago, and they had amazing accommodations. They had quiet rooms. They called the libraries, right? But they had these quiet rooms for people who needed it to be like pin drop quiet in order to do their best work. And they were kind of a little bit darker, very quiet, very cozy rooms where people who required that to do their best work go and work. And so that was an example of designing a workspace right around the accommodations that people might need in order to do it. Not, people don't always have the means to do that. I'm not suggesting that everyone go do that, but I think acknowledging that you're looking for it and acknowledging that you're happy to make the types of accommodations that people will typically may need to ask, having those policies in place, being able to share the policies around accommodations, um, are all things I think that people can do. Supporting different causes. I mean, I think that you're starting to see an intersection and a combination of STEM and neurodiversity, right? I think, I would love to see more neurodiverse companies and agencies and nonprofits kind of be present at different types of STEM conferences. And so I think companies can do that as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and what great advice, and thank you for sharing. Time flies by when we have such interesting topics, and we've covered a lot in this podcast. But thank you, David, for really opening up. And as I say, the career advice was also equally poignant, and as a reminder to our listeners, the thinking about career capital and a growth mindset being two key learns there, which isn't typically probably taught at school. So that's quite a unique way of looking at it. And then, the people listening to these podcasts are our future leaders. They are the future culture ambassadors. So being able to talk openly about neurodiversity, and in other podcasts we've covered mental health, many other topics that really is like you said, it's acknowledging it. If we acknowledge it and then we support our employers, we encourage them to create environments to support it. There's an education that can go up the tree as well as down, and hopefully podcasts like this add that little bit of support to that cause as well. So, David, time has flown by. So for me, this is a massive thank you for being a guest on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Charlie. I mean, I'm really glad you're doing this, and it was genuinely my pleasure and a privilege to be a part of it.
Thank you. And to our listeners, that's another episode of our Future Tech podcast. As many of you know, the podcast is shared on the STEM Ambassador Association, as well as on our website, majorgroup.com/podcasts, and our Spotify and Apple channels. So this is another episode of Future Tech. Thank you, everyone, for listening.